The Old West is a region rich in myth and lore. We've all read the tall tales of gunslingers, shootouts, conflicts, and outlaws from the Southwest to the Great Plains and other locations further west. The shocking stories are mostly true. Many others have been adorned. The mythology of the frontier have persisted in American society for more than 2 centuries. But what about the reality of life at the time? The Great West had considerably more inhabitants than just sheriffs and rail thieves, after all. How did these common people live? How did they pass the time? No matter what the bandits said, regular workers, ranchers, cowboys, and bartenders too required a place to vent. And the variety of their amusements included the uninteresting, fascinating, and unsettling. People had more freedom in the frontier because there was less law enforcement than in other parts of the nation. Numerous of their recreational pursuits followed suit. You'll discover 12 pastimes that regular people in the Old West engaged in today. Number 10. The history of rodeo, lead, or buck. It's possible that rodeos were invented in South America millennia ago. Although conquistadors and indigenous people in modern-day Mexico initiated the practice, it really took off in the Old West. The nation's first rodeo was presented in public by a group of Texans in 1852. It became a hit right away. Countless residents of the frontier communities arrived. Soon after, they continued to arrive. Through the rest of the 19th century, Westerners adored going to rodeos. Both formal performances and casual outings were common in boomtowns. Frontier guys may gather and have a good time because of events. Some clashed. The majority consumed alcohol. They all watched bullfights, roping competitions, steer wrestling, and other cowboy-themed shows. Of course, the major draw was the infamous bucking bulls. Despite its lowly beginnings in Texas, bull riding was promoted as the pinnacle of entertainment. However, additional ranch stunts have developed into rodeo competitions throughout time. The main events were the aforementioned roping and wrestling. The schedule included lasso tricks, horse racing, bullfighting, and bronco bucking. Rodeos started touring after years of Old West excursions. East Coast sophisticated audiences developed a love for the rough shows. Frontier heroes like Buffalo Bill and Bill Pickett viewed this spread as a chance to make money. They set off on the road to perform rodeo shows around the nation. The money poured in. Over time, rodeo gained nationwide acclaim as a popular program. Today's rodeos and stock shows carry on their tradition. Number 9. When Game of Thrones reigned, gambling. Wherever there are a lot of guys, certain vices appear to follow. Drinking and having relations were at the top of that list, as we have already seen. Gambling was also a popular pastime in the Old West. Because it kept customers buying beverages, saloons were serious about marketing gambling. To ensure that patrons remained seated throughout the night, several bars even hired staff to maintain the card tables. Men played a variety of card games, including high-stakes blackjack, with their hard-earned money. Numerous various games were popular depending on the area and historical period. Some had names that were amusing. The card games, Chuck A. Luck, Three-Card Monte, High Dice, and Faro, were all popular. Boomtown saloons embraced gambling over the years. Local sheriffs even turned a blind eye until the situation became too violent to ignore. As one might assume, gaming frequently resulted in fatal arguments. In the Wild West, disagreements over card games were frequent. Arguments would arise over a hand of cards, a claim of cheating, or a lost wager. Men were fast to react, literally, and many of the worst fights ended in death. Today's historians see gambling as a natural component of Western culture. After all, the men who established the frontier frequently came from lifestyles that were generally peaceful back in the East. In these boomtowns, people expected to become wealthy overnight, whether they were mining, prospecting, or ranching. They therefore arrived with a gambling attitude. The energy at the card tables was tremendous when you add that to the fact that guns were present. Gambling has been repeatedly shown to be an extremely dangerous diversion. Number 8. Animal combat. The Wild West was an unkind region. Many women were mistreated at brothels, as we've already learned. Saloons were notorious for their brutality and harshness. Additionally, animals were not exempt from the frontier's barbarism. Animal fighting was one of the Old West's most popular pastimes. Cock battles and dog fights were commonplace. Event organizers in some boomtowns made a big deal out of it. Grandstands made of wood were pieced together by builders to draw paying customers. Chicken wire surrounded the combat area. The hostile roosters were brought inside and given free rein to attack one another. The bouts were often harsh, brief, and always fatal. But there was never any doubt about their popularity. Fans that wanted to see killings inside the ring bought a lot of tickets, making the promoters a proverbial killing. Of course, these events also featured a lot of gambling and drinking. Do some of these Wild West pastimes have a consistent theme to them yet? Bull and bear combat were well-liked sports in the West during the 19th century. California's early settlers believed that roosters and dogs were unnecessary bother. So they constructed enormous bear pits and captured grizzly bears in the wild in California. Promoters would send in a roaring bull after the bear was already in the pit. The two enormous beasts engaged in a life-or-death struggle. These kinds of bear conflicts did not originate in the West. In truth, comparable fights were once staged by the ancient Romans, though it's doubtful the American pioneers were aware of that. However, the bear and bull fights in California were notoriously brutal. Pioneers engaged in the abhorrent pastime of trapping and killing so many bears that the state's grizzly bear population vanished as a result. Number 7. Songsters shows American settlers and native populations clashed all throughout the Old West. Expansion forced local Hispanics in the Southwest and American Indians on the Great Plains from their homes. American settlers encountered some major racial prejudices along the road. The minstrel show served as the best example of this activity. Minstrel shows are described by contemporary historians as the humorous enactment of racial prejudices. At the time, these circus-like performances were immensely well-liked. They didn't originate in the West, but they were king there. Traveling performers performed offensive Black, Hispanic, and Indian stereotypes while wearing blackface makeup. The presentations are viewed as a distressing relic of a troubled time in American history today. Pioneers in boomtowns, however, flocked to the cheap shows of the time. In the East, minstrel shows originally gained popularity in the 1830s. However, what began in New York quickly spread across the frontier. Western films tapped into the country's lawlessness by the middle of the 19th century. Particularly detrimental preconceptions of Indian and Hispanic cultures were reinforced by unique costumes and cosmetics. Technically challenging performances were prevalent. The majority featured coordinated dances and tunes. Even burlesque routines and opera performances were featured in some. However, it is surprising to think about the topic today given how racially offensive it is. Thankfully, minstrel shows lost popularity a long time ago. However, the Old West's cultural hegemony over them serves as another reminder of how brutal life was at the time. Number 6. Pharmacy displays in the West. Itinerant entertainment options weren't limited to minstrel acts. The frontier also had a special spot for medicinal shows in addition to those unsettling performances. Healthcare was scarce at the time in the West. People were therefore forced to pay attention whenever a doctor or quack came into town proclaiming a miraculous treatment for common ailments. That is how medical shows gained popularity. Traveling con artists and fake doctors would set up shop and advertise their wares. People would show up to check out the new drug's purported effects. The salesman's pitches quickly became more aggressive. Soon, they surpassed the actual product in terms of entertainment value. Frontier settlers frequently attended these performances over the years just to take in the spectacle. The salesmen who travel continued to follow as people moved further west. These occurrences developed a greater level of complexity throughout time. Some of them included burlesque performances. Some of them had pie-eating competitions. Under the medicine tent, even the proverbial dog and pony show became the norm. Settlers in search of entertainment in their small town went to the performances. But it wasn't only for entertainment. Sales continued during the period. In fact, according to study by one contemporary historian, during the 19th century, these itinerant health revivals brought in close to $100 million a year throughout the West. Not small change, that. Number 5. Brief history of Buffalo Bill's Wild West circuses. What do you get when you combine rodeos, minstrel shows, and medicine shows? Circuses. One of the first places to encourage circus performances was the Old West. The greatest show on earth, as it is now known, swiftly spread over the frontier. Although different circuses had various attractions, many of them came to represent the later industry. Russian Cossack horsemen circled the large tent in rings. Western crowds were always wowed by trapeze artists. Also a big draw were animal performances. For early audiences, traditional circus organizations like the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey created legendary acts. When one of these businesses rode the rails into town, Western settlers descended in large numbers. These circus feats still evoke a very specific mental picture among Americans nearly 2 centuries later. But Western settlers had access to other entertainment as well. Buffalo Bill adopted the circus concept and gave it a pioneer twist in the late 18th century. Exotic animals, rodeos, and Western culture were all brought together under one enormous tent by the veteran cowboy. Buffalo Bill advocated for pioneer values to the rest of the country more than other former cowboys of the waning age. He paid Native American actors to portray scenes from the history of the frontier. For amazed Eastern audiences, ranchmen demonstrated horsemanship skills, bison runs, and more. The frontier was gradually becoming settled and civilized. However, Buffalo Bill embraced nostalgia for the time period. Long into the 20th century, he and his band of actors performed Old West reenactments around the country. Number 4. Prisoner hangings. Public executions have historically been a common practice among civilizations. The chance to demonstrate to subjects what occurs when one defies the law has long been a favorite activity of rulers. And this vigilante justice has always drawn ancient peoples. It seemed like these ancient ages because of how lawless the Old West was. Consequently, it makes sense that public hangings were a regular sport on the American frontier's unbounded lands. Sheriffs depended on executions to raise public spirits despite their frequently uneven application of the law. Nothing was more satisfying for a local lawman than apprehending and executing a hated horse thief or a ferocious train robber. For lengthy periods of their lives, settlers were frequently abandoned without access to law enforcement. Therefore, they valued this frontier justice from a practical perspective. Their towns became safer as a result of seeing a convicted felon hanged in the public space. Additionally, it provided Westerners with a gory, gruesome escape from their dull daily lives. Public executions were complex rites in the Wild West. The condemned guy would be followed by procession, which would start at the jail. The shackled prisoner was surrounded by police. Nevertheless, the embarrassed guy received taunts and even cabbages from the community. By the time the procession arrived at the gallows, it was frequently at a fever pitch. The sheriff would then read the man his final rites there. Number strongest rope was used to create a specific hangman's noose. The condemned guy was hanged while the crowd roared in approval. And with his passing, more justice was served in a place where there was no law. During the 19th century, public hangings were frequent throughout the West. There have been numerous legal hangings and lynchings that have been documented. To honor all the public executions that took place there, one Californian town even briefly changed its name to Hangtown in the 1850s. This justice was shockingly rapid. But those living on the frontier found it to be quite appealing. Number 3. Competitions in manly. It was a masculine spot in the Old West. Women were confined to the periphery of society, as we already know. Men therefore engaged in stereotypically masculine activities when it came time for fun. Manly games and competitions increased as pioneer culture grew. There were many distinct styles present in these passionate encounters. Some men competed in rock drilling events. Some people competed in steamboat racing. Axe throwing, rifle and pistol shooting, and log rolling were the most popular sports at the time. Another well-liked daredevil activity was wagon racing. And when such flimsy devices couldn't move quickly enough, guys abandoned the carts and went for traditional horse racing. The participating men enjoyed the competitions. Even the onlookers enjoyed them. At these gatherings, there was usually plenty of alcohol and money for gambling. In developing frontier communities, the male sporting activities also helped to build an early sense of community. Some men were well known in their community for being top athletes. Towns gained notoriety for producing icons in a certain sport. Over numerous amicable competitions in the frontier, legends and myths were created. Amazingly, a lot of these sports have survived the test of time. A shooting contest that was first established in the middle of the 19th century will be competed in by hundreds of contemporary cowboys in Phoenix, Arizona, in February 2022. It is obvious that modern men continue to be drawn to the Old West's magnificence. Number 2. Traditional boxing. In the Old West, boxing was one of the best pastimes. It required little space and no equipment. No athletic fields needed to be mowed. The laws were extremely straightforward. There were always two men eager to fight for cash. The wanton brutality of the time also encouraged hostility in frontiersmen. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that one of the most popular sports of the pioneers was boxing. Boxing events frequently sold out. Even Wild West legends participated. Wyatt Earp, a participant at the OK Corral, only recently started officiating boxing fights. He even became known as the champion of the West Coast boxing scene. Thousands of tickets to essentially legal boxing fights were routinely sold in California cities by the turn of the 20th century. As you can anticipate, fights frequently devolved into rowdy events. Participants gambled and drank a lot. Crowd skirmishes started as they became too out of control. All of a sudden, boxing started in the ring and all around it. Sheriffs made failed attempts to control boxing promoters at various stages in the 19th century. Several frontier communities took action to outlaw public brawls. But neither fans nor promoters seemed to give a damn. People continued to swarm to illegal fights. And the most inventive promoters seized the chance to operate legally. If boxing wasn't permitted in a particular community, a play would be presented there instead. By chance, one of the plays, acts, had two men fighting on stage. The vulnerability was exploited, and masses of legal, organized violence were fed. Number 1. The baseball era. Baseball did partial coexist with the Wild West era, despite it being difficult to think America's pastime was a pioneer activity. The game's creator, Alexander Cartwright, focused on the frontier after creating it in the middle of the 19th century. Cartwright accompanied thousands of other men on the trek after learning about the discovery of gold in California. He carried baseball with him, of course. Cartwright discovered that Western settlers enjoyed the sport just as much as their more cultured Eastern neighbors, where it had already been thriving. Unlike Eastern cities, frontier communities did not provide professional basketball. But towns put up amateur teams in the late 19th century. To play teams from other small towns, barnstorming baseball players went throughout the Western continent. Both local pride and a large amount of gambling money were on the stake. Amateur baseball teams soon appeared everywhere from San Francisco to Kansas City. Even notorious outlaws like Will Bill Hickok developed a fondness for the game. On the Great Plains, baseball saw a boom in popularity in 1869. The Cincinnati Red Stockings established themselves as the nation's first professional baseball team that year. They embarked on a national tour to perform for cash. Fans rushed to villages all over the East to watch the new sport. The Red Stockings then headed west. They settled in for a series of exhibition games after they arrived in St. Louis. Teams came all the way from California to compete against the Cincinnati Nine. The barnstorming television series was a huge hit with viewers. It also turned out to be crucial for baseball's future. The popularity of the Red Stockings fueled the expansion of Major League Baseball. And in the West, people began sharing the game among themselves until it